Um, yeah, curious what's on your mind today.
Yeah, I bet you can't guess. Um, I've been I've been thinking about this and thinking that it's something that I really should explain about how what my process is, both on the inside and sort of in the bigger picture in the way that philosophy and sense making operates, the larger lifetime hermeneutical scale. And so, with that as a given, today's topic is about pornographic playing cards.
Okay. I would not have
Um,
guessed.
I would not have imagined you would have, and I think probably most of our audience would not have either. Uh, but it's relevant. It's like almost like a meta comment about our whole enterprise here and about the enterprise of humans taking philosophy.
Okay.
So yeah, for those who are not from the past century, like myself, um, you may wonder what is such a thing as a pornographic playing card. Now, pornographic, what do we call them? Resources are ubiquitous. And so it's hard maybe for a person of today to understand what exactly the role that pornographic playing cards served back in the past century. And with us quaint folks back in the 1900s. so this image, which is quite clever, I can't take credit for it, honestly. It's one that is borrowed, and it's borrowed from a brilliant playwright. And he wrote this play, and they wouldn't play it on Broadway. So it opened first in Berlin, and it opened in Berlin, I think, about 2 to 3 months before I was born. So that's how far back this reference goes. But the playwright's name is Edward Albee. Does that ring any bells?
Yeah, we just saw an Edward Albee play here in Philadelphia a couple weeks ago.
Oh, that's nice to know that it's still out there bouncing around
Oh yeah.
because, when I encountered it, it was less than 20 years old. But now I look at it and it's like, wow, this is like ancient history from the past millennia for a lot of people. so so this piece is called the Zoo Story. And there's only two actors in it, and they have an interesting encounter in what I believe is to be Central Park, New York City. And one of the characters is a what we might call a normal person by 19 late 1950s, 1960s New York City standards, and their encounter happens on a park bench. And the other character, his name is Jerry, I think. And Jerry is a refugee, psychologically a refugee. He's one of the people that the process of modern urbanization has sort of ground up. And so we're sort of seeing the pieces of Jerry that he presents to his counterpart in their encounter in this park bench. It's just genius, genius. And so I actually hunted down the part that rang this bell, and where Jerry says to his counterpart's name is Peter. He says, "What I wanted to get at." He's listing literally all of the elements of his life: plate, cup, silverware, a comb, a brush, uh, you know, and in there is a deck of pornographic playing cards, and along with pictures of his mother and the assorted fragments of this reality. And so he says, "What I wanted to get at is the value difference between pornographic playing cards when you're a kid and pornographic playing cards when you're older. It's that when you're a kid, you use the cards as a substitute for real experience. And when you're older, you use real experience as a substitute for the fantasy. Interesting inversion. So I was thinking, philosophy. This sort of came to me in the topic of how are the fools and sages conversations different than most of the episodes by other channels in the philosophy niche. And the key is in this transition. It's pointed at through the reference to pornographic playing cards, and that is that if we substitute philosophy for the pornographic playing cards, when you're young, philosophy serves as a stand-in for real experience. And we've made that reference before in terms typically of Nietzsche's Prolegomena and in Zarathustra, where we have reference to the individual as a camel being loaded up, who then sets out into the desert. So, so philosophy as a young person is part of that loading up that happens before you set out into the desert. A young person reads philosophy, and I'm thinking of when I encountered it. I was in high school first and then in college. And I was alive, but I had not lived a life. I didn't understand yet the challenges or the opportunities or the illusions or the distractions or the varieties of pathways. I didn't understand myself. I didn't understand that, the inside or the outside. And so philosophy stood in there as a substitute for that real experience, where I had these the wonderful teachers, as Schopenhauer would refer to, that happened rarely through history. And so you had access to them saying, okay, here's what's really going on. And so in that kind of a study, that's the study that we study philosophers. I'm going to study Plato. I'm going to study Aristotle. And it's important in that setting that I get Aristotle right and that I get Plato right as I can, given, as we've pointed out before, the hurdles, both linguistic and hermeneutic in the largest sense. It's people from a different time, from a different culture, living in a different language world that we're leaping across, that we're trying to take meaning, from one world to another world, both internal and external. But I'm taking it, you might say, under advisement. I'm taking it with the idea that it's going to give me a roadmap for when I go out into that desert. Well, here's what it's going to be like, and here's the good, and here's the beautiful, and here's the true, and this is what character is, and this is what ethics are, and this is. So when I'm out there in the desert, I'll have this packed on my back, and I can use it as a reference, and I can feed this transformation that's going to occur. Because in Nietzsche's metaphor here, that camel has to transform into the lion. It's quite a fundamental dispositional shift. It's not that the lion is a bigger camel that's capable of loading on more stuff. It's that the stuff that was loaded onto the camel in the form of philosophy and knowledge and, information in its loosest terms, but it gets loaded on, but something alchemical happens. The load, the payload that one is carrying in interaction with the context of the desert And if we think about the metaphor of the desert is deprivation. That's what it represents psychologically. Why is it a desert? Because there's no water with the fundamental essence of life. We are 98% water, whatever they like to say, right? So what is the desert? The place that's where life is sparse. It represents challenges and limited resource. What do I have in that desert? Only what I've packed on my back. And so somehow with me as the active element, the raw material of my preloaded philosophy now encounters the desert. And through that alchemy, I am dispositionally transformed. A process that Carl Jung would refer to as individuation. But so that transformation happens because of that payload. Uh, I'm transmuted into the lion that then grapples with the dragon, kills the dragon on whose shells are written "Thou shalt," which means that now some agency, some authority has fully come on board as a result of the power generated in the form of that lion
I
that
think twice.
came from the transportation of the payload in the context of the desert and the need of the camel carrying to work that out. And then what's the result? A baby. So, what does that tell us all? This is what's necessary for a good beginning. And a good beginning for what? Because when we start to translate this metaphor to life, this doesn't happen when you're a baby. If you're lucky, this happens sometime through the course of life, and life is mostly the desert until that individuation process has really borne fruit as a baby. So, what it says somehow is that all this is necessary to make a good beginning, to make a genuine, authentic beginning somehow. And so the question then becomes a beginning of what? And I would argue that this becomes the first time that the possibility of really grasping things shows up, because now that authority has come on board and you for the first time are an authentic human metaphysically, not just physically, but metaphysically. And so now that means now you are in the condition of the pornographic playing cards in older life, where now life is there. And the role that philosophy plays once life has happened, post Jornada del Muerte, right? Across the journey of the desert, the Jornada del Muerte is the journey of death in southern New Mexico that was literally coming across the desert where you end up in the town of Socorro, which is in English we have the word succor, which nobody uses anymore, but it means relief, final comfort and relief after a long trial, right? So, but again, that same image, you're crossing a desert and now a beginning can be made. And that beginning is maybe the chance to really understand. And that's the role of philosophy, I would say, as an older person, as an old man. When an old man does philosophy, he's not doing it to study philosophers, he's doing it to understand the life that's been lived. And then the philosophers, they're not providing a roadmap for what you may see in the future. They're more like helping you get the license plate number of the thing that just hit you and drove off on the horizon. What just happened here? How do I, we used to use this term that now has sort of been captured, grok. How do I grok? How do I deeply understand and integrate squeeze all the juice out of and translate it into the most expanded sense of being? How do I get that out of this jornada del vida, right? That ends in muerte. But how do I rock the most of that? How do I squeeze the juice out of that? And now that's the job that philosophy serves. We're no longer studying philosophers. Now we're studying life. Now we're studying the place where philosophy lives, not a description about a place where philosophy lives. It's not a travel brochure anymore. This is more like the memoirs of my years in the war, right?
So I don't know if this is significant to you, but it seems to me that the lion um, is the transition to phronesis. And when you were talking about agency, it occurred to me that a quantum leap in agency happens twice in that allegory. Once when the camel becomes a lion, and again when the lion conquers the dragon on whose every scale is written thou shalt, right? Because there's those are described as sort of separate stages. And um and I'm wondering relative to the idea of phronesis, what kind of staging we might be aware of, like the
Well, I think
levels of phronesis.
there's an earlier step there also that's worthy of recognition, and that is the very first step that the camel takes into the desert when he's no longer at the loading station and now he's left the last water hole behind and he's setting out into the desert. I can still remember that day, and I'm sure many of us can. And for a generation, it was getting shipped off to basic training. Uh, but there's
I remember
there these are
stepping
what
off
we
the
call rites of
Greyhound bus.
passage, right?
I remember stepping off the Greyhound bus in Santa Fe, New Mexico, um, having made a 3-day journey to get there and having no idea what was next, like how long I was going to stay. And, just dropped out of college, um, pretty much on my own. I think I had like $50 um, to my name. So yeah, it was, I do remember that first step into the desert quite literally.
Yeah, and it's an important transition. And when its time comes, you're prepared or you aren't, and maybe you're always to some degree unprepared. But no, I can remember that. I can remember sitting at a stoplight right around my 21st birthday, getting hit by the fact that my official childhood was over forever, and the weight of that, became real in a certain way that, I mean, I wouldn't have told you it wasn't real up until then, but then, you know, I still had dimensions of it to get somehow, and but so I guess all of this was a footnote for our listeners, because what you see me doing is not, you probably gathered, I'm not the expert to go talk to about Heidegger or Spinoza or Plato or Levinas, or I like to talk to those people. But my purposes are different than they would have been when I was an undergraduate and I was trying to learn about Spinoza and I was trying to learn about, the philosophers and their models as maps to move into the future.
I,
Go ahead.
I'm not sure my question landed, so I wanted to just try it again. And so I was wondering about these stages of agency. The camel steps into the desert. The camel becomes a lion. The lion fights the dragon, and is there a teaching in that, whether Nietzsche intended it or not, about phronesis having different stages,
Oh,
of which conquering the dragon is only the final stage, but other stages are important.
uh, I'm not sure that that's in Nietzsche. Nietzsche becomes a dream world at a certain point, dream world slash opium dream, uh, with some other hallucinogens thrown in there. And so it becomes a dream world of certain passages. And I do think, for example, one that and for okay, so if you haven't read Nietzsche, to get Nietzsche really depends on what you pick up. Uh, if you pick up some of the stuff that's more specific philosophy, like Beyond Good and Evil or something like that, it reads more or less like philosophy, I guess I'd say, aphorisms, speaking to reason. But if you dive into Zarathustra, also sprach Zarathustra, also spake Zarathustra, who was the central sage of Zoroastrianism, which turns out to be at the root of Platonism and of a lot of the Western traditions. It's one of the chapters before, right, coming from Persia. So so it's like a fever dream. Like I read this years ago, but the parts that stick to my mind, for example, he's going along and he hears the barking of a dog. Now, this is a book about philosophy. He hears the barking of a dog. And so he goes and he finds a shepherd boy, and the shepherd boy's dog is there barking, and the boy's rolling on the ground with a big black snake, and the big black snake is biting him, and he's fighting it, but it's biting him from inside his own mouth. It's like fever dream, right? And so Zarathustra runs up to him and he shouts to him, bite it off, bite down. And the shepherd boy, with great effort, bites down and spits out the head of the snake. And then he's transfigured and rises up into the sky or something like that. Like, so this is not an argument about ethics or how we epistemology, or like, this is not the philosophy we're used to, right? Or here's another one. Uh he goes into the town and it's the center of the village, and there's the marketplace, and there's like a setup for a little carnival, and there's posts like telephone poles on either side of the marketplace with a tightrope strung up between them, and there's little houses up at the top, that open up a little door out to the tightrope. And one of the doors, he's there with the crowd watching, and one of the doors opens up, and the tightrope guy comes out, and he makes his way, and he's balancing, and he's patiently making his way across the rope. And when he's about halfway through, another guy comes out, and he runs down the rope behind him, and he comes up right behind him. Go on, quick, faster, faster. And the guy freezes from the shaking on the rope. And so the second guy leaps over him and lands on the rope ahead of him and goes racing off and disappears in the house at the other end of the tightrope. And the jumping on the rope so discombobulates the first guy that he falls off the tightrope, boom, breaks his neck, dead as a doornail. This is another image. But that's not weird enough yet. Zarathustra takes the corpse of this dude and he goes out into the hills with him, and he puts the corpse in a hollow tree, and he lays down to sleep, and he has a dream, and the corpse speaks to him in the dream. This is why you shouldn't do drugs, kids. um, but anyway, so this was the Ubermensch, the overman who leaped over the normal person. This was the new philosopher that Nietzsche felt he was heralding the age of, right? But my point about all this is that there's a lot of bizarre imagery and a lot of, if you wanted to make an argument that things were immersing or were bubbling up out of the collective unconscious that were only partially metabolized by reason or understanding or pinned down in the context of the daylight world. There's just a lot going on there. And then there's various interpretations that get associated with this and various things that have been, you know, thought about it since. For example, popularly the black snake that the shepherd boy was struggling with is recognized to be the Catholic Church, right? And so so this idea that our transcension be, and then when he transmogrifies up into the sky, this is him symbolically turning into the Ubermensch, right? The human that has not yet manifested, but who comes with a sort of not a patient, reasoned sort of a process that's built on the 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 past and the accretions of cultural knowledge, but it's like a shattering, a breaking apart, this just sort of intuitive, uh, chaotic sort of energy that comes with the new philosophers of Nietzsche in this new world where God is dead. And Nietzsche's not saying that God is dead is necessarily the way to a peaceful world, right? Uh, but but anyway, so there's a lot going on there, and I think it's very hard to even get a sense of it without also having a sense of where the world was at in those days and how that all translates. But but I guess my biggest point is that, at least about my initial note, is that what I'm doing is meant to support a later process. I think it's useful. You remember how we spoke about how how in a sort of a philosophical practice there's two halves. There's reading the law and then there's case law. There's reading the books about medicine and then there's what do we do about Joe sitting in front of us. That there's the science and there's the applied science, so to speak. Well, I guess I'm arguing that the same works in philosophy when in vivo, in life. And that is that we read the philosophy and it sort of sits as a iconic, timeless map. But the thing that you're asking about stages of is in how am I taking that with me, loading it into the desert, taking it into my life, wrestling with the everyday obstacles like it's morning again, what do I do? And uh, and that transmogrification having stages, but I think maybe there's something about we can either take this on or we can sort of try to avoid it. And maybe the important takeaway for those of us that aren't necessarily the Ubermensch as Nietzsche envisioned, uh, there is still a bringing ourselves to that process of individuation or a sort of punching the time clock and not maybe doing everything we can towards unfolding. This kind of connects to the fatherhood conversation about an image of how do we manifest with all of our colors shining, in the sun.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
what you
what
were
those stages are, I mean, I suppose uh, there's obviously there's a lot of ups and downs of those stages because it's a process of taking on and then trying, maybe through insufficient, in a context of insufficient experience, and gaining that hard won experience to be able to build on it, and then another element of that is going to be relationships with mentors or what they would call a phronimo, right? Which is a person that exemplifies
enemy.
exactly much more fruitful, hopefully, and although perhaps as challenging at times. right? Because that process is a refinement. And I think that that's also been a relevant thread. Uh, that we've, another one string banjo song, and that goes under the topic of making yourself a fitting vessel, and meaning that we're working on life, so to speak, but life is also working on us. And then if we want to work on life in a way that it works back on us the right way, so that we get the results that generate phronesis, that actually grow fruit, that actually, spin that cycle of life instead of just weight it down by living off of it. Um, there's another way it shows up to me. And so yeah, all of this sort of falls under the topic of how we become who we are, and the utilization of the resources of those antepasados I refer to occasionally, which means technically those who have passed before us in Spanish. Those are our ancestors, but when we say ancestors, it's not the connection of them having passed before us on a path that we share in some ways isn't made as emphasized. And that's why I like the term antepasados, because they don't have to be our personal ancestors for them to be people who have passed before us, who have left us important clues to the big picture, right? But so I guess that, there's this idea that life is lived forward but understood backwards.
It
So
seems like that's kind of what you're getting at with the playing cards.
that's what I'm getting
Right.
at with the playing cards,
Yeah.
is that what we're trying to do. Now, don't mistake this to say that if you understand backwards, those messages are still useful when applied in a frontward focused direction. So, and that's why their philosophy is useful to us. For them, it might have been reflective. For us, it's projective. They're reflecting off of the past to give us their distilled wisdom, but we can take it on and project it into the future. He drank that stuff and died, so I'm going to not drink that stuff and therefore not die. It was his reflective experience, but for me, I can project it and not have to necessarily, if you're smart, you watch your friends on all fours vomiting from alcohol, and then you never have to really go through that experience. You can deduce it from your seat if you're clever, right? And if you're one of the top learners, so um, so I guess that's my point, is that I don't want to disappoint people who are coming saying, well, he doesn't do justice to Heidegger. I'm sure I don't do justice to Heidegger. I'm not sure Heidegger does justice to Heidegger in that particular example, um, but because I'm using it in a different way. I'm using it in that post facto uh, grist for the mill to grind up something that's already been fed into the mill. It's not a for a what if projection into the future as much. It's more like uh, looking back at things and seeing ways that of interpretations that I distill out of it based on my experience base, based on my hermeneutical horizon, the sense making of, reinforced by the old model, but taking an actual living thing and sort of meeting those together. And that's difficult to do in a purely scholastic situation. And that's why our approach, where you ask a question, you don't tend to ask questions like, what did Heidegger really mean when he said present at hand? Or it's more like, here's an example from life that people are likely to encounter. What does the model reflect on that, distilled from the optics refined by a life's experience? Yeah. And so this is a slightly different thing. And I would have, argued that it's maybe a click closer to application, but It is also more idiosyncratic, which is to say that it is interpreted from my seat. And so that you don't want to copy maybe my interpretations as much as a process that empowers you to interpret from your seat. You will get, what is the lawyer thing at the bottom? Actual results may differ. They should differ. The system isn't working right if they don't differ, at least to some degree, right? That's why nature made you when it already made me, maybe, and it said, well, okay, we need to reiterate this, but with this tweak. So you're supposed to get a different result in certain respects, right? Um, so, yeah, I don't know what I still didn't. I've still danced around stages because I think that also, maybe there are some general ones, but I think there's idiosyncratic process because it, we have to bring ourselves to this work, and we don't always do that consistently and homogeneously through life. There are times when we're
I
focused, and then there's times when we coast, and then there's times when, you know.
I
So
suspect there's a mental model worth um, making explicit about stages, and um, I'm not aware of the literature well enough to know who has covered this, but I assume it's been covered. And Seasons of a Man's Life gives a sort of roadmap of stages, um, and even as they relate to um, ultimately individuation, I think, uh, and it kind of illuminates what are the big questions um, that happen in a certain sequence, more or less, that enable individuation or its frustration. But I'm thinking like individuation has been on my mind lately because, well, I think for a lot of reasons. For one thing, I always assumed that it was a process that more or less had an end, and I keep finding it. I'm not there, and I find that frustrating, and I don't know if other people have that experience or I've heard people say, "No, no, I made it. Like I'm through." Okay. That's not
I saw
my
a quote.
experience.
I saw a quote where they said Carl Jung said he thought that Jesus was the only human that had completely individuated. He, of course,
Yeah.
was a Christian, but I could
And
see
by the
that
way, the
that blurring with a spiritual attainment field goal
and
image.
the baby in Zarathustra also reminds me of the Christ figure and the beginning of what it becomes a little bit of a nuanced question in that way. But um, but in the individuation process, I'm imagining that there are some steps similar to, say, the Great Chain of Being, where you have consciousness and then you have consciousness, conscious of consciousness. There's that kind of uh, process. And then there's also these spheres of material from which to become individuated. And those are richly layered. So I'm not sure it's even worth expounding them. But, like one of the reasons individuation has been on my mind is that um, hanging out at Passover last week with family, I experienced a bunch of different relationships to Judaism, or what I would consider belonging in a peoplehood. There was like, this has nothing to do with me. I'm just going through the motions. There was, I'm into the traditions, but I don't really buy into the whole religious aspect of it. There was, I buy into the peoplehood aspect of it, and I kind of want to go through the motions of the traditions because that makes me connect to the peoplehood. And I saw all of these and my own that's touched on several of those phases over over time. as like versions of individuation, and the rejoining element that I think might be a component of individuation, um, maybe like in the spiritual sense, experiencing the collective consciousness more clearly, even if you're sitting alone in a cave, right? The sense of interconnectedness or being part of a field, it ends up an outcome of a solid individuation effort. Um, so yeah, I I don't know. I think it might be worth doing some thinking on that, and um,
Well, I think there are a lot of models for that.
yeah.
One of the old images they used to call Jacob's ladder,
Hmm.
where you definitely have the sensibility of a hierarchy and a sequential attainment series. I think the 10 bulls represent that.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think that there's two sides to it, right? There's the working out of the outside of the landscape that it happens in, which is unique. And then there's the individual that has to adapt to that landscape, which is unique. And so there might be a an ontogeny, ontogenetic sequence or agenda within the individual, but how it interfaces into that outer world might be quite different based on location, but also location in time. That's why I've always been interested in these ideas of, does history have big chapters? And in some of these models, though, there's 4 stages. Well, what is the psychology of people born in stage 1 that developed in that, as opposed to the psychology of their great grandchildren, which will be in a stage 4, right? Or their children that would be in a stage 2, whatever your stages are, but there are a number of these. So you get these, like, it's almost like a Mayan calendar thing. You have one series of cycles, and then you have another series that might go on different. And then somehow those line up to generate a whole field of possibilities. And that's where I start thinking of things like the periodic table of the elements and valence and you know levels, and a series of valence within that, right? Positive and 1, 2, 3, negative 1, 2, 3, and the zero channel, which is where silver, copper, gold, so there's this idea, perhaps, that a Jacob's ladder would be a modeling of that, an analogy of that translated to consciousness, that, say, that matter was modeled on, because let's say, a geometry that falls out of vibration that shows up as a periodic chart of elements, that an analog of applies to mind. And so you have these different stages on Jacob's ladder, from you know, deep in the negative to some neutral zone to into the heights of saintliness. But I think there's a bunch of different models. You might find that every spiritual tradition maps that somehow or some different way, at least for the ones that do mapping. I think that there are procedurally oriented lineages that might not map as much as, say, Buddhists do. Because I would assume that some of the Buddhist lineages would have all these different places mapped out,
Yeah.
all the territories of mind. And yet, some of uh, the more native lineages might very much depend on the individual's prowess and the individual's attainment within certain areas, and that might be quite unique to that person. This is like, certain shaman that have certain powers that come from certain extraordinary relationships, but that aren't necessarily a stage on everyone's process. that represent a special, unique, not everybody has the same magic in those traditions. So no, there's some interesting. That's where I think we're served by a multi-model approach, because they all kind of are built around certain insights or certain dynamics that they've managed to clear up and clean up and kind of be able to work around. Because I sort of take as an assumption, because these things continue so long through time, that they manifest a certain utility either internally or externally. And we might not always, or we might never understand entirely what those are. What are the selectors for that? But I do think there's some, you know, yeah, this is, we keep coming back to the issues around Heidegger, and that is the danger of the issue that phenomenology centers around is this: I'm trying to understand the world, but all of the world comes through me, and I don't adequately understand me, and so that inadequacy becomes an amplifier for everything that I try to understand through me. So it's a two-faced problem: to understand reality itself and to understand myself. It's a gas and a clutch thing. I can't get too far ahead on one or without keeping the other one more or less balanced to it. So, and this is the danger when we say you shouldn't have too much scientific power unless you've made gains in morality. This is a similar sort of an argument that says that there's a gas and clutch relationship between external and internal development. And so, um, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a calling there that shows up as the potentiality of humankind. It is within our realm, but we may have to go through certain dispositional disciplines before we master that. Uh, um, and it's interesting because you, I see when I look around me all sorts of, instincts that there is some way that we can do this out of a higher place, but it seems chimerical because it only seems to get interpreted through a glass darkly, as it were. Um,
I was talking to a philosophical friend recently who is kind of bemoaning the fact that um, that the human race really needs to stop thinking of who's right and find a way to hold what she called the whole, WHOLE, and also that we need to transition from figuring out how different value systems can coexist to describing the value system that we all um, that represents all of us. And whereas these are ideas that I have espoused before, I don't think I buy in, at least in any reasonable time scale, to those kinds of ideas coming to fruition. Like in my 20s or 30s, I don't know if I ever would have thought there's such a thing as a moral war, but now I definitely do. I do think that sometimes there's right and wrong, and sometimes um, one value system is um, more conducive to life than another, say. And I don't see a whole that is holdable or uh, opportunity to describe a value system that we all can resonate with. I just,
yeah. It has a least common denominator kind of a feel about it.
which is
But
not a great outcome.
Well, and if we look at history, like there are some people apparently that would literally eat you. It's a very controversial finding, but it's not disputed at this point.
Some of them are
This is
still
what
around.
this happened here, right? This is a thing, right? And so that argues that, yeah, there are times when you may well have to, defend your own existence. And, but there's this idea of a great unity, the great wholeness, and that we're working our way towards that. Bergson is very interesting in his comments about that, and it feels suspiciously correct. He says that if there is such a thing as a great unity or a great wholeness, it's behind us. It's not ahead of us.
So
What we're
does he have a telos? Does Bergson
um
describe any teleology?
I think that what he would say, his in fact, I would encourage our listeners who are interested in this idea of evolution to go to our audio bookshelf where I actually will read to you Creative Evolution by Henri Bergson, where he discusses exactly this. And he discusses teleology, which he calls finality. And, the other end of that is mechanism. And either it's just ping pong balls just happening to fit together the way they happen to fit together, which is kind of a random mechanism, or there's one thing that it's heading for. And the genius of Bergson is that he throws both of those out, and he finds the root of the problem in our thinking about things and the way that we're tuned as a dispositional issue. It's not that we have the wrong propositions. It's that we're running the machine the wrong way. We're using a mechanism intended for one thing, intended for creation of artifacts, and we're trying to apply it to speculation, and it's not speculative software. It's not made for that. And if you want to do that, you have to do this other thing. And then he gets all talking about intuition, and it made some people feel very, very slippery slopey, you know. And but hey, strap on your snowboard. Life is a slippery slope, you know. And but I one of his reasons against the idea of finality is that we don't see nature trying to make the perfect animal. And similarly, we don't see even human culture trying to make the perfect culture. Although some might argue they might read history differently. But in fact, what we see, I would argue, from a creative evolutionary standpoint, maybe uh, that what we see is the human differentiation to all of those niches, all of those external landscapes that I was talking about that all required specific adaptations. Well, that's what we see. We see life spreading out across the board. We don't see it uh, running like a championship elimination where we get into the semifinals and then although some people want to read humanity as having won the semifinals through manifesting consciousness. But what he would argue, I think, is that what we're seeing is consciousness manifest all these different ways. And I think a lot of more recent science would support that. A squid or an octopus it's not that it doesn't have a consciousness. And I don't know that we could even say how conscious it is of its consciousness, but we know it's really, really different. And that it might be different in dimensions that we can't entirely map on our hardware. Right. So 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 that's sort of an argument against the idea that we're moving more and more towards a perfection. I suspect that it has that both inside out, that its perfection is in its manifestation as multiplicity, and that the unity that it shows up within the elan vital, the urge that makes all that happen. That's where, when we trace it all back down through this creative process, that one unity that was the original impetus, like the hitting of the ball, and then that only gave it one shot, and now it's all based off of that. That's that burst of life manifesting through elan vital. And the idea is that it's like of an expansion out from the center, not a cohesion down into a single telos, a single end or goal. And that as it goes out into that expansion, that adaptability, yeah, it goes through mechanistic aspects, but those mechanistic aspects are all impelled by that initial energetic push to life. This Hunyuan Chi that I've referred to, this Taoist idea of primordial energy bursting out to shine through everything. So
Quantum potential, I think.
yeah, yeah. And so I think that Bergson represented a very interesting chapter. In some sense, I put him in there with Lao Kun, one of my heroes. Lao Kun, for our audience, our listeners that don't remember, is the dude at Troy who said, "Don't bring that big horse thing in here. What are you, crazy?" And they were like, "Shut up. It's a cool horse. We're bringing it in." He's like, "What are you doing?" But nobody ever listens to Lao Kun, right? That's sort of that voice. And so Bergson was kind of like that, except people really listened to him. Like caused a roadblock, a traffic jam on Broadway when he came to give a philosophy lecture, and he caused a this
Those
is
were different
crazy.
times.
Those were different times, argued with Albert about time.
I've
And
been looking for a transcript of that. I'd like to read it. Um, 'Cause the other topic that I thought we might pick up today, if it wove itself in, was about what are the implications of time not being linear, and um, it's kind of a fun idea, but it's hard to apply it. So we'll have to come back to that in another episode. But I'd like
yeah,
to find that transcript first.
yeah. Well, and that's also, it's funny how, yeah, I liken all of this theoretical theories and thoughts to like a map of a big city, and there's all these different byways and side alleys and things, but often you'll be in a place that seems new and unique somehow, but you can jump over a wall and end up someplace you've been before and that you know quite well. And what we're going to see is that this question of time is going to go right back to this question of there's an inside and there's an outside in a self. And where does time exist? And is time the experiencing of time? And all of that all gets tied up again with the mystery of the self. Um, who am I? Who am I? Which is has what am I in there too, which is
Yeah.
Heidegger again. What am I? Well,
And individuation again, right?
an individuation again, and yeah, yeah. It's the only game in town.
Yeah, good.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Brian. Some food for thought. I look forward to continuing the conversation, and be well in the meantime.
Yeah. Enjoy the spring.
Thank you. You too.